They were all wrong. Because while they were busy underestimating me, I was busy dismantling their entire shadow network across my continent. And what I'm about to share isn't just what happened in Burkina Faso. It's the blueprint for how Africa finally stops being the world's playground. They said I'd never have the courage to do what I did last Thursday. Western media called me just another African dictator making empty threats. Israeli intelligence dismissed me as a young soldier playing politics. Even some of my own advisors whispered that I was moving too fast, too hard, too dangerously. My name is Ibrahim Traoré, and this is the story of how I declared war on Benjamin Netanyahu's African empire. Let me begin with something they don't want you to know. For the past 15 years, while African leaders were signing development deals and smiling for photo ops, Netanyahu was building something very different. A spiderweb of intelligence operations, data harvesting companies, and surveillance networks stretching from Lagos to Nairobi. They thought we were too poor to notice, too desperate to say no, too divided to fight back. But I noticed everything. Do you want to know what really triggered last Thursday's operation? 3 weeks ago, my intelligence chief walked into my office with a folder. Inside were communication intercepts, financial records, and satellite imagery that made my blood run cold. Israeli-backed companies weren't just doing business in Burkina Faso. They were mapping our mineral deposits with military precision, recording our political meetings through compromised telecom networks, and tracking the movement of our citizens through facial recognition systems we never agreed to install. But here's what pushed us past the point of diplomacy. They were sharing this intelligence with multinational corporations, helping them squeeze better deals out of African governments. Our own data was being weaponized against us. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my office until dawn and made a decision that would change everything. At 5 a.m., I called my military commanders. Operation Clear Sight begins in 2 hours, I told them. No leaks, no delays, no mercy. At exactly 7 a.m., while most of Ouagadougou was still waking up, my forces moved on 17 targets across the city. The first was a telecommunications company on the eastern edge of town. From the outside, it looked like any other office building, glass windows, a shiny corporate logo, employees walking in for another ordinary day. But nothing inside was ordinary. My soldiers entered without warning. What they found made international headlines within hours, though most media outlets refused to tell the full story. Rooms filled with servers powerful enough to monitor communications across half the continent. Hard drives containing the personal data of over 2 million Burkina-based citizens. Encrypted phones with direct lines to Tel Aviv intelligence offices. And thousands of documents proving how our national security was being systematically compromised. And that was just the beginning. By 9 a.m., we had raided 6 more Israeli-linked operations. These weren't just businesses. They were sophisticated intelligence outposts disguised as NGOs, tech companies, and humanitarian groups. Everywhere we went, the same pattern repeated itself. Surveillance equipment, African citizens' data package for export to foreign servers. Secret communication systems bypassing our national security entirely. The evidence was overwhelming, but I knew evidence alone wasn't enough. The world needed to see action. So at noon, I walked in front of the cameras and said words I'd been preparing for months. Africa is no longer your laboratory. We are no longer your test subjects, and we are no longer your blind spot. Those words weren't just for my people. They were a direct message to Benjamin Netanyahu, who at that very moment was likely receiving frantic calls from his African operations team. And within 6 hours, something unprecedented started happening across West Africa. The president of Mali called me personally. Ibrahim, he said, we found similar operations in Bamako. What should we do? Shut them down, I told him. All of them. Guinea's military leadership reached out through encrypted channels. They had been tracking suspicious Israeli activities for months, but didn't know how to act without sparking diplomatic crises. I gave them permission to stop worrying about diplomacy. By Thursday evening, 3 neighboring countries had frozen Israeli military tech imports. 4 more were conducting emergency audits of foreign-backed infrastructure projects. And the African Union was privately discussing something never attempted before: a continental strategy to counter foreign intelligence infiltration. But here's what truly terrified Netanyahu's government. This wasn't just about Israel anymore. The evidence we uncovered showed direct cooperation between Israeli operations and the intelligence services of France, Britain, and the United States. Our telecommunications systems had been compromised not by one power, but by an entire network. For decades, they had been sharing intelligence about Africa like we were a commodity to be divided among themselves. That realization changed everything for me. Because this wasn't just Israeli overreach. We were fighting a colonial mindset that never really ended. It just swapped gunboats for technology. The morning after our raids, I got a call from an Israeli diplomat demanding to know on what authority I had acted. I told him clearly, on the authority of a sovereign nation that refuses to be spied on. But the call that really mattered came 2 days later. Netanyahu himself requested a private line through diplomatic channels. "President Traore," he said, "I think there's been a misunderstanding about our activities in your region." "Mr. Netanyahu," I replied, "the only misunderstanding was thinking we wouldn't notice." He tried to claim that Israeli companies were helping Africa, creating jobs, building infrastructure. I cut him off. "Mr. Netanyahu, when you build infrastructure that spies on the people it serves, that's not development. That's occupation with better marketing." The call ended after 12 minutes. Netanyahu never called back. But his government's response came fast, and exactly as I expected. Israeli media started reporting that I was destabilizing the region and threatening democratic partnerships. European newspapers published opinion pieces questioning my so-called authoritarian tendencies. But let's be clear, these are the same newspapers that never once questioned why foreign intelligence operations were even legal in African countries in the first place. Their propaganda campaign might have worked 5 years ago, but something has changed across this continent, and they're too arrogant to notice. Young Africans don't get their news from European outlets anymore. They see right through the language of partnership and cooperation when it's really being used to justify surveillance and exploitation. The night our operations concluded, thousands of people gathered outside the presidential compound, not to protest, but to celebrate. Young people held signs saying, "Our data, our choice, and Africa is not for sale." University students organized workshops on digital sovereignty. Even my critics had to admit that what we exposed needed to be exposed. But the strongest support came from an unexpected place. African leaders who had been quietly frustrated with foreign interference for years began reaching out privately. Presidents, prime ministers, and military commanders from across the continent shared intelligence about suspicious foreign activities. What emerged was a clear picture: a system of surveillance and data extraction far bigger than any single country could handle. That's when I realized we needed something brand new: an African intelligence doctrine, built by Africans for Africans. Over the following weeks, I worked with leaders from 6 West African nations to draft what we now call the Continental Digital Sovereignty Framework. Its principles are simple, but revolutionary. Full transparency for all foreign investments in telecom and data infrastructure. Any company operating here must submit to audits run by African oversight bodies. Zero tolerance for undeclared intelligence activities. If an operation can't prove its civilian purpose, it will be shut down immediately. Continental cooperation in monitoring and responding to foreign interference. What affects one African country affects us all. And the principle that worries Western governments the most: African data stays in Africa unless African nations agree otherwise. This framework isn't just about protection. It's about recognizing a truth. Information is power, and African information must serve African interests first. Of course, Netanyahu's government dismissed our framework as unrealistic and economically damaging. They warned that Africa couldn't survive without Israeli technology. But they were wrong. Within 3 weeks of enforcing our digital sovereignty protocols, we had new offers from China, Russia, India, and even some European companies ready to operate under transparent conditions. The truth is, the world has no shortage of technology partners who don't need to spy on their customers to do business. The real surprise came from American intelligence officials. In private conversations with African diplomats, they admitted they were reassessing their own data collection practices. Not because they wanted to, but because our framework was already inspiring similar initiatives across the global south. And once one continent demands digital sovereignty, it becomes much harder to deny it to others. The ripple effects spread quickly. Morocco introduced new restrictions on foreign data collection. Kenya launched a full audit of telecom partnerships. Nigeria now requires foreign tech companies to store data inside its borders. Even South Africa, usually cautious about confronting Western partners, declared that African infrastructure must serve African interests first. For the first time in decades, Africa is setting the terms of technological engagement instead of just accepting whatever is offered. Let me be clear. This isn't anti-Western, and it isn't anti-Israeli. It's pro-African pragmatism. We welcome partnership with anyone who respects our sovereignty. We reject any relationship built on surveillance, deception, or the assumption that African consent is optional. Netanyahu's government could have chosen transparency. They could have asked permission instead of assuming forgiveness. They could have treated us as equals instead of targets. They chose otherwise, and now they are living with the consequences. What's fascinating is watching how other world powers adapt. Chinese firms, despite their own reputation for authoritarianism, agreed to our transparency demands. Russian partners accepted full audits without complaint. Even some European companies now advertise themselves as African digital sovereignty compliant. The market is rewarding transparency and punishing surveillance, just as we hope. Meanwhile, Israeli firms once operating freely across Africa now find themselves locked out, not because of politics, but because they refuse to meet the transparency standards that are quickly becoming the norm. Netanyahu assumed African leaders would always trade sovereignty for short-term profit. That mistake is proving costly. But maybe the biggest change isn't in governments or corporations, it's in how young Africans see the world. University students are studying our framework, holding conferences on technological independence, and demanding their governments adopt similar protections. A generation is growing up believing their data, their communication, and their infrastructure must serve their own interests first. That expectation will shape Africa's relationship with the world for decades to come. 6 months after Operation Clear Sight, I can report this. Burkina Faso's digital infrastructure is stronger, safer, and more transparent than ever. Internet speeds have improved since we ended compromised partnerships and replaced them with transparent alternatives. Telecom costs are lower. Our sovereignty is restored. Most importantly, our people now know that their government protects their digital rights instead of trading them away. The lesson for African leaders is simple. Technological independence isn't just possible, it's profitable. The lesson for African leaders is simple. Technological independence isn't just possible, it's profitable. The lesson for foreign powers is also clear. The age of assuming African consent is over. We are not the continent that says yes to everything. We are not the market that accepts any terms just because we think we have no choice. We are the continent that demands partnerships based on mutual respect. And if you can't offer that, there are plenty of others who will. The choice is yours. But our choice is already made. We choose sovereignty. We choose transparency. We choose an Africa that controls its own digital destiny. Everything else is negotiable. Benjamin Netanyahu learned this lesson the hard way. He won't be the last world leader to learn it. The only question is, how much will it cost others before they understand what he now knows? Because one way or another, they will learn it. The age of African digital colonialism is ending. What comes next depends only on how fast the rest of the world adapts to that reality. This is Ibrahim Traoré, and this is how we reclaimed our digital independence.